Bienvenidos a Mexico y la playa. Welcome to Mexico and the beach. Yeah, I'm starting class at the beach today. What does the beach have to do with comparative media? Well, I'm going to use today's lecture in a different way than I've been using the other video instructor lectures, because I want to show you Mexico. I want to take the opportunity of me being down here to help us lead into the chapter material, not just from the vantage point of reading a book in some sterile room in a Pennsylvania building. I don't mean that pejoratively, but I'm saying I'm here in Mexico, so I want to take advantage to show you. And I'll use it as a way to lead into media use, and I will also use it as a way to talk about my time here in Mexico when I was researching media until now, because there have been some recent developments which are talked about in the chapter. So I'm going to provide that bridge from Mexico of old to Mexico of contemporary Mexico when it comes to media use. The sacrifice for this video today is you will hear some wind noise. We're going to have to deal with that, but it's all part of the environment, because the environment has a lot to do with media use, does it not? I mean, media use often arises because people don't have access to their natural environment, or it's not that interesting. You don't have access when it's really cold or really hot, so you stay inside. Therefore, media become more desirable to pass the time. So that's access. The other dimension that I just mentioned has to do not with access to media, but has to do with whether media are interesting and more interesting than your physical environment. So if you're in what you consider to be a boring surrounding, it may be your house and maybe your neighborhood, then you're going to maybe look to media to relieve that boredom. Whereas if you're at a place with a beach, and I'm going to show you parts of the beach as I start to open up the real Mexico, I hope. If you're at the beach, it's very interesting, and it tends to draw you outside. So I'm showing two ends of the beach. You'll see that it's pretty desolate. Not a lot of tourists here now, as I mentioned, but you can find people on the beach during certain holiday periods. And the beach is lined with high-rises like you see in the distance there, some of which are resort hotels. Others, like this one, are timeshares and condominiums. But these are also these commercial resorts blended with people's houses. And once again, this is Mazatlan, Mexico. This is on the Pacific coast. Very different from Cancun in the Caribbean. This is a working city, Mazatlan. It was a trade route for China. Yeah, China was sailing just around that bend there. There's a harbor, a marina, and China opened it up as a trade route. And actually, that's how drugs got into Mexico, and specifically into Mazatlan, because China was transporting opium originally. And then they found that they could make it up in the mountains of Mexico, the Chinese, and that then converted into cocaine and heroin, and that's how the drug trade got started. And of course, the end consumers for the drug trade are mostly Americans, you know, driving the demand. So I'm walking down an alley now. I'm going to head back to my place as we continue on, just to give you an idea of where the video is going. And the way that I got into Mexico was my parents took me here when I was 2 years old to Tijuana. We lived in Southern California, and lots of Mexicans were in my classes. And then when we went to Texas to live in Houston, I was at yet another Mexican border town, Brownsville and Monterrey. So, and I was also going to school with Mexicans. So I already had an affinity for Mexicans in my early life, but it was when I went to write the book for this class, Comparing Media from Around the World, that I then really got to know Mexico. I came down to Mexico and I interviewed media experts, not just professionals working in media, but also government regulators. And I did that in 3 or 4 states down here. And so I feel that I have a pretty intimate knowledge of Mexico, and it really introduced me to the country. And in fact, while I was down here, the U.S. Embassy became so interested in my research, comparing media from different countries around the world, that they hired me as a consultant to come down and work with some of their journalists to help teach them the principle of objectivity, which was not practiced that much in Mexican media. So I'm here now as a person reflecting back on that time period in this class. My book is out of date and there have been some changes. And let's try and tackle some of these changes in the Mexican media industry as we finish out vaguely talking about Chapter 1 today. I would like to just mention that we've already covered Canada, as you know. We covered the United States, and now we're going to cover Mexico, and it's really those three countries that are occupying the same neighborhood, if you will, in this corner of the world. We have that big block of land. It's just us three, right? But the media systems are vastly different. So the Canadian system is much more in between an American system and a European system. And by that I mean there's a lot more publicly funded media in Canada. The biggest example of which is what I sent you yesterday to the CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. So that means when you turn on television or radio in Canada and you go through the dial, you're almost as likely to come across as a public broadcaster as you are a private broadcaster. In the United States, it's almost completely different. The landscape is almost completely profit-driven. You have a very, very small public broadcasting sector in the U.S. You have NPR, National Public Radio. It's not that well funded. Most of you will not ever listen to it in this class, although a couple of you have already identified that you do. It's not really geared for you. It's geared for elite audiences. And then you also have PBS, or the Public Broadcasting System. And that's something that we get to know through Sesame Street when we're kids. Our parents are looking to have a babysitter, maybe one way to look at it. And then later we kind of disappear from PBS. And when we start to watch Disney as another babysitter, I'm being a little bit facetious here in the way I'm talking about these things, but there is accuracy to it. And most people don't return to PBS until later. There's only those two choices for the most part, and when it comes to public broadcast media. Mexico has more of a balance between Canada and the United States. And especially in recent times, which you will get from the chapter, you'll see that in Mexico there's, in recent times, been an expansion of public media, public television stations, government-owned radio stations, the IMER stations. You can read about them in the chapter, IMER. And so these three countries together present some interesting differences. All right, I'm getting ready to cross a noisy road here. You can see a big green bike path that they put in the middle of the median. And there's an example of a green bus going down. That's public transportation. All you have to do is put your arm out and they stop. And you get right on. You don't have to go to a specific bus stop. Very easy, very convenient to use. Walking across the street here. Some beautiful shots. If there's such a thing as a beautiful bike path, this is it. And now we're going to cross over the rest of this busy road here. Right here's an empty parking lot, but if you come here around 6 or 7 o'clock at night, this taco stand comes to life. And people are coming here who are Americans, Canadians, Mexicans, and they're making things right on that barbecue grill right there, not using electric stove, not using propane, they're using natural briquettes. So I'm going to take you through a little trail here. Somebody trimmed some bushes here, so they haven't cleaned them up. So I have to step over some branches. All right, continuing on now with much more of a quiet ambience. I'd like to head more into some of the chapter material, and I want to talk about Mexico as being a very different developing country. Mexico is a developing country. Do you know that term? If you're a person who uses the term third world country, you're really showing yourself to be out of date and, dare I say, ignorant. Because a third world country is a name that's held over from the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States, where every country that lined up and supported the United States was a first world country. Every country that lined up and supported the Soviet Union was a second world country. And all the other countries which were too weak to support one of these, because if they did, and the advantage shifted to the other side, these small countries are too weak to resist. So they have to remain neutral all the time. Those are third world countries. It's a very condescending term. We don't call countries that anymore. We call them developing countries. But Mexico is a very interesting developing country because unlike other developing countries, it has no problems feeding itself. I mean, all of these houses in here, in their little backyards, they're all growing all kinds of fruits, nuts, and food is just plentiful in Mexico because of the environment, because of the land, etc. So that's not a problem. And also, in Mexico, the broadcasting and the telecommunication and the print media industries, in short, media in general, are really well developed. Really well developed versus, for example, like Ghana, Africa, which I have also been to, where you're still trying to build out television to the extent that you can't even broadcast 24 hours a day because you don't have the content for it and you don't have the personnel to produce. Now, Mexico doesn't have that problem. It's a very robust media industry. I'm passing here what I call that cactus garden. Somebody's done a little nice job with it, making their lives interesting, right? You come out of your house, are you going to be drawn to your phone and going on your phone if you're living here, or are you going to be looking at your cactus garden? I mean, that's for you to decide. So to continue on with Mexico, it is the second largest media market in all of Latin America. And maybe you can guess that the first one is Brazil. So we're talking about a very big, robust media market here in Mexico. And there was a law that was passed, a set of laws passed from 2016 to 2018, not too long ago, which changed the structure of how broadcasting is regulated here in Mexico. When I was doing my research, broadcasting was regulated by the executive branch of the Mexican government. And so that means that whoever was president and his or her party, there hasn't been a her yet, but his or her party, I'll show you another look at some Mexican houses down here. Whoever's president of Mexico had tremendous influence on regulation of the media and in a bunch of areas, in censorship, and advertising rates, and who gets to purchase new properties. All of that changed, though, in 2016 to 2017, when there was this law passed called the Federal Telecom and Broadcasting Law. So the Federal Telecom and Broadcasting Law established two federal independent agencies, just like the FCC we have in the U.S., established two federal independent agencies. One's called the Instituto Federal de Comunicaciones, Federal Institute of Communication in English, and the other one is called the Comisión Federal de Competencia Económica. So that's Federal Commission of Competitive Economics. And the main idea behind these two government independent regulatory agencies was try to break up the monopolies that existed in Mexico. And you can see in the chapter, those monopolies are still going strong. Let's talk about two of them. I guess you would call them an oligopoly if there are two of them, but they have monopolistic tendencies. They control the market. That's what we're trying to say here. So in the television sector, there's two big TV networks. You've got Televisa, or Televisa, as they pronounce the V in Latin cultures. And that is controlling 80% of television content is coming from Televisa. Okay, now we're coming up, by the way, to the division that I live in, Villa Marina. You can see the sign up there. And like most Mexican communities, they have security outside and gates so that people coming down here feel safe. Even though I personally feel safe. Remember what I told you about the Coca-Cola truck? There you have cultural imperialism coming right at us. How would you feel if you were in the United States and a big truck came driving up to you and it had the Mexican flag on it, or it had Tonatila, which is a vanilla soda, right? Cultural imperialism. So at any rate, back to the regulation of media in Mexico. What we have now is at least an attempt to break up those monopolies, and part of the regulation that was passed allows for 100% investment by foreign companies in Mexican media. In Mexican telecommunication firms, which would be their cell phone companies. 100% investment, but only 49% foreign ownership in broadcasting. However, previously there was no foreign ownership in broadcasting, so that's trying to open up those markets. So, but still you have Televisa. It still has the best resources for producing fiction. Fiction is talked a lot about in the chapter. And it has connections still in government, where it's able to influence regulators. Yeah, there's a lot of corruption in Mexico, a lot of exchanging of money still. But we've got Televisa, and then the second network is Azteca. And so these two players had a stranglehold on the Mexican media market. Let's get past this guy weed whacking. As a result of the reforms that took place through the law that I mentioned, there was a new TV network that is established, and this TV network is known as it's a new network to my name as well. What's the name of it? I thought I had it in my notes here. Imagen. I'm not quite sure how to probably the I is pronounced with an E. Imagen is the third network, and it's still trying to establish itself as a producer of content that people will want to see. All right, I'd also next like to talk about radio now. Radio in Mexico is very different from the United States in a number of respects. First of all, you have a lot more indigenous radio in Mexico. You know, people in the United States often don't realize that Mexico is a really old country. The very first printing press in North America is from Mexico, in Mexico City in the 1500s. And Mexican indigenous culture goes far back before that. Mayans, Aztecs. Yeah, so you have a lot of Mexican indigenous culture that still exists in Mexico. It wasn't wiped out like our indigenous culture through the Trail of Tears in America and putting people in, well, I guess you could call them concentration camps in a way, or Indian reservations as they were also pejoratively named. But that's not the history in Mexico, although indigenous peoples, they were brutalized, don't get me wrong, by the conquistadors and the emerging Mexican population. But you still see indigenous peoples in large communities, in small villages. And so the government has a radio network, the IMER radio network, which allows these people to preserve their culture, to preserve their really old languages. Like there's an old language here in Mazatlan that's called Nahuatl. And that language, historians should say, should not go away. And so that's what IMER stations are doing. So that's one difference in Mexican radio. And then you also have a lot of public radio as well. Radio that's run by a municipality, or radio that's run by a charitable organization, or radio that's run by a university, which we also have in the United States. You have a lot more public radio. That means radio that's not running advertising. It's not trying to get the biggest audience possible. It's not just providing entertainment. It's also trying to provide a public service, provide information that helps people to get by in their lives. So that's a difference as well. And then finally, there was a difference that does not exist anymore. I'm kind of glad to see it taken away. And it has to do with, you might have picked up on a term talked about in the chapter called concessional radio. Concessional radio is, I guess, is there a way for me to kill my dual camera? I guess not. I'll try and make your view a little bit more interesting. So, yeah, I guess you might want to see my dog. Some of you said a couple things about him. All right, I'll sit over here. All right, so concessional radio is a kind of radio where you agreed to, as a radio station, allow the government to own certain time slots in your radio programming. And the government would use those time slots, be a half hour long on a Saturday morning, for example, as part of your licensing agreement, the concessional licensing agreement, would use that time period to promote what the government was doing. So if it was, for example, trying to talk about a new bridge that was being built, or talk about a new high yield of corn. Corn is a very important crop in Mexico. Or to talk about any advancement or progress or good things that are happening, that's what the government was using. So it was a kind of corruption, right? Because in order to get your license, you had to agree to this concession, and then that also means that the government is going to have a platform for free. I mean, the U.S. government does not take over radio. And that's essentially what we had happening in this prior system, which seems to have been eliminated now. And now stations are licensed not according to whether they're permit stations or concessional stations, but they're licensed as to whether they are commercial, public, or social use. Social use is going to be social media. So it's interesting to see Mexican law, another example of how it's not your traditional developing country, having some very advanced law that has to do with social media. I'd also now like to talk about newspapers. Newspapers are not talked about in the chapter. Newspapers are still a very important form of media in Mexico. Mexico is very much interested in politics. Most Mexicans are. And they're still trying to get a sense of stability in their country. It wasn't until the year 2000, which is 21 years ago, that we had the first time in Mexican history where a government was elected that was not the previous government that was in power for 91 years. 91 years, which just shows you that every time that government got elected, it certainly wasn't free vote. No country's going to vote for the same party for 91 years in a row. And so that system has resulted finally in a president winning the presidency in 2000 from a different party, and then since then there have been different parties in a general attempt to reduce corruption through laws and moving things out of the executive branch of the government into independent agencies like the broadcast regulators are. So this creates an environment in Mexico where people are really interested in politics. And that means there's a lot of newspapers in Mexico. You can even see one of them cited in the chapter. You can see we're going to be talking about an ombudsman in a few minutes. But when you see a particular quote from La Jornada, Jornada would be how the English spelling is, that's a very big Mexican newspaper. They're very political, and they tend to take a political tack. So one might be really left-wing, one might be left of center, one might be center, one might be right of center, and one might be extreme right. And these were the journalists, for the most part, that I was conducting workshops with in Mexico City, in Ciudad Juarez, which is Juarez City, in Veracruz, which is another state, in Puebla. These are all places in Mexico. And I was helping journalists to see the way to achieve objectivity is you can do it a couple ways. One is through presenting two sides to a story, or three sides, or four sides. And the other way is to let one story be in favor of a subject one day, and then the next day run another story against it. So I did those kinds of workshops for people because politics is so interesting to the average person in Mexico. And now that brings me to another dimension of media that we have in Mexico that you don't have so much in the United States, and it's called the ombudsman. You can see the ombudsman talked a little bit in the chapter, O-M-B-U-D-S-M-A-N, wish it was ombudsperson. Ombudsman. An ombudsman is a person who represents the rights of the media audience. So if you're captured on film drunk and you're embarrassed by it and somebody broadcasts it, you could complain to an ombudsman. If the ombudsman is working for a media organization and has any power, they have the ability to force the media organization to make a correction. Not that a person can get their reputation back if they've been portrayed as a drunken person, but that's what the ombudsman do. Because you think about it, people who are covered by the media, they don't have many rights, right? If you get interviewed by a television reporter in the United States, you're usually very excited, but there's also that possibility that they're going to edit what you said, and it's not going to come out exactly as you intended it. And so that's what the ombudsman is all about. All right, now moving to wrapping things up in Mexico, I definitely want to mention perhaps the most well-known piece of Mexican media outside of Mexico, and that is the telenovela. The telenovela, which means tele-story or tele-novel or tele-fiction or televised fiction, however way you want to look at it. And the soap opera is a form of fiction on TV programming that all of these TV networks are trying to produce. Mexicans really like fiction in their TV content. But it's a much different kind of soap opera than you will find in the United States for a few reasons. One is the Mexican telenovela is going far more places in the world than American soap operas. You can find telenovelas watched in Moscow, Russia every day because people who watch them find the storyline so compelling. Usually in a telenovela, the actors work on the show for 6 months, and then it's done, and they move on to another show or another telenovela. In the United States, you have the same actors for many, many years on the same soap opera. Also, there often is a class conflict that's portrayed in the context of a romance in telenovelas, a class conflict. So you have a rich male who's in love with a poor female or vice versa, and that creates the drama because the families don't like the mixing of the classes in this romance. And then finally, the good people and the bad people are really clear in Mexican telenovelas. The black hat, it usually signifies that a person's a bad person in Mexican telenovela. The white shirt, you can say that's racist in a way, right? But you have this very clear demarcation of who's a good person and who's a bad person in a Mexican telenovela. And just in general, the drama is much more suspenseful, I think it might be fair to say, compared to an American soap opera. So that leaves us now with making some remarks about where Mexico is headed with the future. The chapter calls it Back to the Future because it's returning to a time period before in some ways. But we do know that there is a growing preference for fiction, even though fiction is already preferred in Mexico. Mexicans, they love telenovelas, they love storylines, dramas, they love movies, all of which are much more in the fiction realm than the reality realm. Not that they don't appreciate reality programming. Mexican watching the news, that's reality programming, but fiction is very, very big, in part because of the telenovela's success. And then also another factor in Mexican media as we head forward is growing competition from the public sector. And that means that in addition to Azteca and Televisa having their monopolistic structures threatened by additional commercial broadcasters, you also have them being threatened by additional public broadcasters because those broadcasters are taking audiences away from those legacy media companies that have had monopolistic control in Mexico. So there's a little bit to introduce you to Mexico, to show you some background. I did bring my class here 2 years ago. That's what I would have done with you guys if we weren't in a pandemic. We stayed in a hotel on the beach. It was a tremendous experience. But that doesn't mean that I can't communicate some of Mexico to you, especially when we're studying Mexico in a chapter. Que tengo buen día. Have a great day. Adios. Hasta luego.